across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and it's Happy President's Day. Going to spend some time, as you might imagine, talking about President's Day. I'll hold up even the booklets that we've made available to those of you that requested what was called the Patriots Pack, and we'll be making some of those kinds of things available again during Truth Team. But One Nation Under God, the Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers, Constitutional Interpretation, the Patriot Pastors, and we will certainly be adding to that. As a matter of fact, we'll be adding to that. If you are a Truth Team member, we'll talk about that more in just a few weeks. But it is President's Day. We will begin with that. And it turns out the way the schedule turned out, we will end with that because we'll be talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe, who is the executive director of the Providence Forum. We're going to talk about some of the very famous prayers of the presidents. And in between, we will get into some issues in the news. Nathan Sheets was going to be with us the first hour, be with us in the second hour. We're going to get into issues like agriculture and nutrition, a variety of other things that you need to know about. But I thought we would begin by a piece that comes from the editors of the National Review, in which they say there is no such national holiday as President's Day. Again, for those of you who are younger, you may not realize that we used to actually have Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday, but nevertheless, they say today is a federal holiday. Our popular culture and even the law in some states now refer to the holiday as President's Day. That habit started by effectively combining the mid-February birthdays of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They go on to say that Washington well deserves his own holiday, as we argued last year, and they have a link to their editorial last year. On the books he still has. Americans have celebrated his birthday since 1778. It has been an official holiday since 1879. Congress in 1968 created what was called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, which moved Washington's actual birthday, February 22nd, to the third Monday in February as they said, a giveaway to federal employees, unions, and travel industry, both of whom value three-day weekends more highly than our historical patrimony. I might just mention, this is a live show, by the way. Banks are closed. The post office is closed. Schools are closed. I found out that my granddaughter is not only off today, but she's off again tomorrow. And as a matter of fact, the bank in our building, of course, it's closed, but even the online banking of the bank in our building is offline at the moment. And I know there are certain businesses and all sorts of other individuals that are not in any kind of state of openness. And so we are doing a live show today on February 16th, but it's apparently a little bit unusual since this has become quite the holiday. By the way, the editors go on to say we celebrate Washington and Lincoln not only for the offices they inhabited, but what they did for the country. In Washington's case, that extends well beyond his actions as president. In Lincoln's case, some of his finest moments came in the service of a campaign for the Senate that he lost. Both men understood that public office is a means, not an end. And they go on to say that presidency is an honor as well as a trust, and more significant, probably even more of a trust than an honor. And they point out that the Constitution bans nobility, hence maybe we shouldn't have all these birthdays, but they did point out that very quickly on, we had individuals recognizing that this was not going to be kings. This is not going to be a monarchy. Washington dressed in civilian clothes as a private citizen and allowed James Madison to talk him out of giving an inaugural address that would have proposed a legislative program. Thomas Jefferson converted the State of Union speech into a written message regarding the pomp of the speech as too monarchical. And sadly, the speech was revived, as many of you may know, by Woodrow Wilson for that same reason. Presidents once held open receptions to shake hands with the general public. John Adams answered the White House door. Ulysses S. Grant actually drove his own carriage and paid a speeding ticket, one of those little footnotes in history, when he was pulled over. James Garfield was shot while waiting for a train, escorted only by his Secretary of State. So some things have certainly happened in that regard. So they say if some of those trappings of a monarchy and powers of the modern presidency are unavoidable, we should at least not encourage them. Neither Congress nor the Supreme Court has its own holiday. The president doesn't and shouldn't. The holiday belongs to Washington. So, nevertheless, that is their argument, that if you're going to have a holiday in February, it needs to be George Washington. He goes into some more detail, but we'll leave it at that because I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about the fact that when we get into this issue of media bias, and I'll hold up our latest booklet on media bias, oftentimes media bias isn't what the media says, it's what the media doesn't report. One of the articles I've posted for you here has to do with Kathy Rumler, who has been, up until recently, the top attorney at Goldman Sachs. And she is leaving due to her ties with Jeffrey Epstein. We have mentioned Jeffrey Epstein before. We will continue to mention him, not only as the New York financier, which is the way he's oftentimes listed in some of these stories, but also a convicted child predator who was found dead in his cell August 2019. We'll get into that in future ones. But it turns out that we have all sorts of files now that show that she's not just actually an individual that worked at Goldman Sachs, but interestingly enough, she was actually advising Jeffrey Epstein on tough questions about his sex crimes, discussing her dating life, advising him on how to avoid unflattering media scrutiny, and addressed him as Sweetie and Uncle Jeffrey. She is mentioned more than 10,000 times in the documents provided by the Justice Department. So you say, what's the problem? Well, not only did she work with and for Jeffrey Epstein, and not only has she been a top Goldman attorney, she was, drumroll please, the White House counsel for Barack Obama. And somehow the media seems to just keep leaving that out. And you might say, well, that's maybe not as relevant since she's at Goldman Sachs now. But just turn it around. If she had worked for Donald Trump, if she had worked for George W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, don't you think it would have gotten a message and a mention? And certainly that is the case. So I posted this, just one more illustration of the fact that oftentimes media bias occurs when the media doesn't talk about a very important issue. And one more I'll just mention in passing. Right now, Washington, D.C. faces a severe environmental crisis. There was a ruptured underground sewer line that has now leaked over 200 million gallons of sewer waste into the Potomac River. It is a major biohazard. The situation isn't safe. They're talking about the fact that it's going to take months to fix it. And you might say, well, I wouldn't expect to hear about that since I don't live in Washington, D.C. Well, guess who else did not cover this? That'd be the Washington Post. I think that might be something you might cover. And she might say, well, why didn't they cover it? Well, it turns out that the individual who was appointed to the National Infrastructure Advisory Council by Joe Biden, that'd be David Geddes, he's also the CEO and general manager of DC Water. So again, so interesting, one of the editors actually said, journalism is about covering important stories, covering it with a pillow until it stops moving. One more evidence of media bias. I'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program recently, we had a roundtable discussion about AI sermons. What stimulated the discussion was the article, Majority of Pastors Now Using AI to Prepare Sermons Amid Rapid Embrace of Technology. Leonardo Blair reports that the majority of pastors are using AI tools like ChatGPT and Grammarly to prepare their sermons. The 2025 State of AI in the Church Survey report provided the interview data. Nearly two-thirds of the church leaders surveyed prepare sermons using a wide variety of AI tools. Although some seem to be grappling with the ethical and practical considerations involved, most believe that AI can be beneficial. Currently, there's a range of AI tools that a pastor or anyone can use to prepare a message. At one end of the spectrum are tools that help you polish something that you are writing. Emails, blog posts, newsletters, or sermons. Checking spelling, grammar, or historical facts can be done with search engines. and software built into word processing. Using these tools doesn't seem to raise any significant concerns. We would assume that church leaders would use such technologies to improve what they write and speak. At the other end are AI tools that essentially do all the work. For example, you could ask ChatGPT to write a sermon on 1 Peter 3 or a sermon on the 10 Commandments. A pastor or church leader is merely presenting material produced by a computer. We realize that most would be inclined to modify it somewhat to fit their audience and their own personality, but the essential material came from a computer. I'll leave it to you to evaluate how you feel about this. We were concerned that the church may be using AI tools too much. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, this we can talk about this whole issue of voting. We're heading into the first opportunity votes, I would say, for some of you in certain states because of course, the primaries. And, of course, we have a midterm election in November. But as early as tomorrow, I could early vote. And I suspect some of you are living in states where you could vote very soon. So this whole issue of voting, very important, first of all. But more importantly, we have the SAVE Act, which has passed the House, now again in front of the Senate. It passed last year, but they have now a revised one that's passed the House in front of the Senate. You see some senators saying they're going to vote for it, some that are not. I will hold up our booklet, A Biblical Point of View on Voter Fraud, which came out many years ago. We will certainly update it as we have more facts and figures. But Kevin McCullough, who is a fellow talk show host, and by the way, he's going to be on the program in the future. Matter of fact, when he comes on, I'm going to say, we talk about you a lot when you're not on the air with us, because he's talked about one citizen, one vote, period. Pretty straightforward, except in the United States. And so he goes into it. He says, look, there's some moments in American history where common sense finally breaks through the fog. This week, he says, we witnessed one. In a narrow but historic vote, the House of Representatives passed the Save America Act, legislation that does something so basic, so obvious, so foundational to self-government that it's almost embarrassing that it needs to be debated. It says you must prove that you're an American citizen to vote in American elections. That's it. Nothing radical, not extreme, not suppression, just reality. And again, this was put forward by a number of individuals. Chip Roy, who's a representative in the state of Texas, by the way, also running for Attorney General in Texas now, is an individual that put this forward. And you did get, at least one Democrat, Henry Cuellar, who's a Democrat in Texas, voting for it. But it pretty much was vote down party lines, which is a sad commentary right there. He says, make no mistake, this is a landmark moment for election integrity. For years, Americans have been gaslit. They've been told that asking for ID is racist, that proving citizenship is oppressive, that questioning the election system is dangerous, that wanting secure elections is anti-democratic. And the media, led by, and he gives you some examples, have often treated this issue like a political football instead of a constitutional imperative. But he says, here's the truth. Are you ready? Some of you might want to take some notes, because this may be something if you want to contact your senators about this, or maybe you see a opportunity in an open meeting, maybe a town hall meeting, to express this. Every legitimate democracy, Kevin points out, on earth requires proof of identity to vote. France does, Germany does, Canada does, Japan does, Mexico does, India does. Yet somehow in America, he says, the idea that only citizens should vote has been framed as controversial. And he says, well, okay, let's start with some first principles. Voting is not just a right. It's the highest responsibility of citizenship. It is how sovereign people govern themselves. If non-citizens vote, then sovereignty collapses. In fact, we're going to talk more about that tomorrow in a teaching about why empires have fallen in the past and what we can learn for this particular country in the future. So he says that's why the Save America Act matters. It requires documentary proof of citizenship to register. It establishes a nationwide voter ID standard. It creates uniformity instead of chaos. It restores confidence instead of confusion. And it tells every American voter, your voice matters, and we're going to protect it. One of the best ways to look at that is to look at a very succinct statement that comes from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who said, American citizens decide American elections. Period. Pretty straightforward. He goes on to say, look, for years, Democrats have resisted voter ID and citizenship verification under the guise of access. But access without integrity is meaningless. He says, I was just talking about banks a minute ago. Imagine a bank that says, we don't check IDs, we don't verify accounts, we just trust everyone. Well, the bank would collapse overnight. Yet we're told elections should operate on blind faith. That's insanity. He points out all the things that we've noticed, what we call the elephant in the room. And again, if you haven't seen my booklet on voter fraud, it's now many years out of date, so we'll update it again as we are in the midterms here with some of the latest facts, figures, statistics, and all the rest. But we have noticed some irregularities. You have as well. We've noticed inconsistencies. You've probably noticed that as well. They've noticed rule changes made without legislatures. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic. They noticed ballots arriving at strange hours. Yes, we have. As a matter of fact, have you been looking at some of the studies been published right now about Fulton County there in Georgia? Yeah, that's one of many that have come out. We've noticed officials who couldn't answer basic questions about the electoral system. So again, instead of transparency, they've offered censorship. Instead of audits, they've offered accusations. Instead of reform, they've offered lectures. And he says, here's, I think, an uncomfortable truth. You need an ID. You ready for the list? And he has a short list. You need an ID to board a plane, to buy alcohol, to rent a car, to open a bank account, to enter a federal building, to buy a firearm, to apply for welfare, to get Social Security, but you don't need an ID to vote. What's wrong with this picture? I think you can get the idea. And so again, Congressman Roy says, let's turn up the heat. Every senator should be forced to answer one simple question. Should only American citizens vote in American elections? It's not a tough question. I think if you go to a town hall, here's the question. Should only American citizens vote in American elections? Yes or no? No speeches, no spin, no filibusters. Just answer. Because if the answer isn't yes, then they don't belong in public office. Anyway, it's a very good piece by Kevin McCullough, great writer and, of course, a talk show host. And we will have him on in the future. So you can, of course, ask him questions. And I just thought it would be helpful for you to have at least one more piece that I think in a comprehensive way talks about one citizen, one vote, period. It's on our website. I would encourage you to maybe grab it, post it on your Facebook page, on your X feed, maybe pass it on to some individuals. It's a pretty good case that he makes for that as well. And so, again, that is on our website at pointofview.net. And when we come back, I want to talk about a speech that Marco Rubio gave in front of the Munich Security Conference. And he wasn't the only one there. As a matter of fact, individuals that are either in the White House or the cabinet, in this case, Secretary of State, or individuals running for the presidency show up at this. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was there, actually made a little bit of fun of Marco Rubio, but didn't do that well in that platform. And certainly a number of other people like Gavin Newsom and others were there as well. So we will talk about that because it illustrates kind of what is happening in Europe, what is happening in America, and why this administration is simply saying, Europe, we really just want you to survive. We really even want you to thrive. but we really aren't really interested in actually helping you completely destroy yourself. And so it's an interesting speech that he gave, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Let me just mention that if you go to the website, we've got videos, we've got action items, but my Viewpoints commentary, I won't get into it again until maybe sometime in the near future, talks about the fact that on our radio program, this was about a week ago, talked about the fact that there is pretty good evidence right now that a majority of pastors are using AI to prepare sermons. And what does that say about technology? What does it say about the kind of messages we might be hearing in your church in the future? So if you wanted to know more about AI sermons, we have, of course, information about this article that was in a very prominent location. But there was also the State of AI in the Church survey report that gives you some facts and figures about that as well. So if you are interested in artificial intelligence, you're wondering if maybe we're using artificial intelligence for too many things, including even sermons that you might be hearing in your local church, that certainly is an issue. At the same time, I point out we would expect pastors to use some kinds of tools to correct their grammar or check some facts. But it's one thing to maybe check some facts, to evaluate whether or not you're using right grammar in emails or blog posts. It's quite another to have ChatGPT write your sermon for you. So I'll let you read it and make some comments about it, and we'll be back right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Let's see if we can focus for just a few minutes overseas, foreign policy, because after all, some very significant speeches given at the Munich Security Conference. That is a place where oftentimes future presidential candidates go to begin to talk about this country and sort of establish some of their foreign policy credentials. And that's why Gavin Newsom and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others were over there when that really doesn't have anything to do with being a governor of the state of California or even a member of Congress. But it does if you're thinking about running for the presidency. So there you go. But nevertheless, I wanted to illustrate that by holding up a couple of books. This is a book that was written 20 years ago by Mark Steyn. Now, I recognize some of our audience is younger, and they might say, I don't even know who he is, because after all, this book was written 20 years ago. It became a New York Times bestseller. But the implication is that if you look at what is happening to Europe, eventually America is going to have to go it alone. His primary argument was about the fact that we are seeing many of these countries in Europe at that time, 20 years ago, being run by more and more Muslims, and that the influx of those individuals that don't necessarily have Western values are certainly going to change those countries. Yes, France may still have a place called Paris. They may still call it the Louvre, but it's going to be a very different France than it was even, say, a few decades earlier. And so that was his book 20 years ago. Then he followed it up. I'll hold up this one, which came out 15 years ago, called After America. Those of you watching online can see that these are very thick books in which he spent a fair amount of time really arguing for the fact that if we follow this trajectory, this is not going to be good news for Europe. They are spending more and more money on social programs and not on the military. And that, of course, gets us to Ukraine in just a minute. They were actually less likely to give money to NATO, although that brings us to the fact that Donald Trump changed some of that around. And they also were lauding the idea of multiculturalism. Diversity is our strength. Well, that hasn't worked out so well either. So Marco Rubio is the second person in the administration, the first being the Vice President, J.D. Vance, to speak to Europeans about his concern and the general Trump concern about the fact that Europe is heading in the wrong direction. One of the articles here says that during this, he recalled a time when we had a Cold War, when much of the world lived behind an Iron Curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. But instead, there was an attempt to turn that around, and our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice that they refused to make. And so even though it looked like maybe this menace of communism would take over Europe, they actually turned that around. And so he outlined what he says should be a transatlantic alliance ready to defend our people, to safeguard our interest and preserve the freedom of action that allows us to shape our own destiny, not the one that exists to operate a global welfare state and atone for the purported sins of past generations. Last time we had Marco Rubio on this program, we talked about some of those issues in his book. And I might point out that his speech won praise in Munich and from nearly every corner of President Trump's domestic coalition. Interestingly enough, he was drawing, as this article says, from Ronald Reagan's playbook of conservative internationalism, unapologetic about the leadership the United States can provide and the superiority of freedom, but at the same time wary of diplomacy and commerce that might lead in the wrong direction. And in some respects, some people said J.D. Vance kind of played bad cop. This time, Marco Rubio played good cop. But they were both essentially pointing out that you can't continue down this road and actually succeed. And so even though maybe he wasn't necessarily pointing to the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he's basically saying that this idea of having a world's middle powers is delusional and cynical. But I thought just for a minute, before we move on to some other issues, including the Trump tariffs, which we've posted some information on, I would just give you a few of the quotes from what he said. Marco Rubio said that for 5 centuries before the Second World War, the West has been expanding, empires extending across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across the vast swaths of the map for years to come. Many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But he points out decline is a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States wants to do now together with you. This is perhaps the most sobering statement he made. We have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. We do not seek to separate, but to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in Western history. We're not planning on being the caretakers of you just going in the wrong direction. This is the end of your empire unless you want to turn it around. By the way, that's the topic we're going to talk about tomorrow here on Point of View. He goes on to say, no global welfare state, no apologies for the past, no woke future, no asking for permission, no pretending that Western civilization isn't the best one that has been created. An alliance based on the recognition that what we, the West, have inherited together is something that is unique and distinctive and irreplaceable. Because of this, after all, is the very foundation of the transatlantic bond. These are the words of a man that may someday be president, and it was interesting to see what he actually said there at the Munich Security Conference. And I thought since the press probably won't cover it or will cover it poorly, we might at least mention it today here on Point of View. But just before we take a break, you might say, well, I don't have that much interest in what's happening overseas. I'm disturbed about what's happening in Ukraine, and I think Europe is maybe going in the wrong direction, but I just need to pay my bills. Well, what about that? Well, this is a piece that came out from the Wall Street Journal, which they said, you're paying 90% of Trump's tariffs. This, I think, is going to have to be an issue that will be addressed during these midterm elections, because the editors, the Wall Street Journal, put it this way. No matter how often President Trump insists his tariffs are taxing foreigners to enrich the U.S., economic studies keep showing that Americans actually pay the bill. On Thursday, it was the New York Federal Reserve's turn. In an analyst on the bank's website, 4 researchers write that last year, nearly 90% of the tariffs' economic burden fell on U.S. firms and consumers. Now, they reached that conclusion by examining import data to see whether foreign suppliers cut their prices in response to Mr. Trump's added tariff costs. Over the first 8 months of 2025, 94% of the tariff incidence was borne by the U.S., the analyst says, meaning a 10% tariff increase caused only about a 0.6% point decline in foreign export prices. Now, to be fair, this income changed a little bit later on. By the time you get to November, the tariffs had maybe an 86% pass-through to U.S. import prices, so a little different. But the researcher said, quote, our results show that the bulk of the tariff incidence continues to fall on U.S. firms and consumers. These findings are consistent with 2 other studies that report high pass-through of tariffs to U.S. import prices. And again, the point they're making is this. Economists sometimes can see what part of higher prices is due to core inflation, what part is due to oil shocks, what part is due to avian flu outbreaks, what part is due to tariffs. But you know what? Most voters just walk into the grocery store. They walk into the mall. By the way, I love this. Walk into the mall. Who's going to malls anymore? Anyway, let's go walk into the mall. They don't think that way. They simply see price tags going up, and Mr. Trump promised that they would drop and maybe even go down. And so, again, this is going to be an issue. We'll continue to follow this. Maybe there's some contrary evidence to challenge this, but at the moment, it seems to me that a lot of reports are saying, who pays for the increase in tariffs? Well, either the company does or you do. And if the company does and you buy goods or services from them, well, ultimately a lot of that gets passed on to you. So just wanted to put that on the table. It, I think, is going to be a very significant issue of affordability in this campaign. And we will come back and finish off this hour and then get into our guests next hour right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's mention just in a few minutes, we will be talking with a couple of different guests. Next hour, we'll have Nathan Sheets with us, and he is an individual that is running for Agricultural Commission. But whether he wins or loses, I think is going to be a great conversation about what is happening in agriculture. The number of family farms that are no more, the number of farmlands that are being taken over by foreign countries, which is really of concern. Then the whole issue of nutrition, whether or not we are providing the best kind of food for the American people, having clean diets. Just some great conversation we're going to have with him for about a half an hour. And then Jerry Newcombe will be with us again because it's President's Day. We thought it would be good. Originally, we were hoping to have William Federer with us, but Bill Federer will be with us in the future. But Jerry Newcombe will be with us. We'll talk about some of the prayers of the presidents, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, maybe Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, just to mention a few. And so I think you will appreciate the second hour in which we'll have our guest with us by phone. But let's, if we can, come to this last piece that I've posted by Ben Shapiro, in which he's talking about the con consuming American politics. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about nihilism. Now, nihilism is probably a word we don't use every day, but it's the philosophical viewpoint, if you will, that everything in the world, life, the universe, everything, it doesn't have any meaning. Again, it's something that naturally arrives out of an evolutionary view, of a secular view that mass, energy, chance, and time gives us the universe. There's no good, there's no bad, there just is. There's no right, there's no wrong. And the core views of naturalism, certainly, and nihilism have existed for some time. But he's seen this as a much more significant issue, especially among the young. Next time we do one of our next generation roundtables, I'm going to suggest that they put the issue of nihilism on the table to discuss, because that is the case. Here's how Ben Shapiro puts it. There's a growing sense of frustration coursing through American politics, and it is no longer confined to one party or ideology. He says the frustration has its roots in a number of things. The lack of credibility that many of these institutions had during the COVID-19 pandemic. We talked about some of that on Friday with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford. The whole breathless conversation and coverage of Russiagate, but then the unwillingness to even admit that we had Hunter Biden's laptop. Artificial intelligence looms as something that could give us answers, but oftentimes is seen as a threat. And, of course, we have a political class which is shamelessly, he says, corrupt. But he says the frustration does not remain static. In the United States today, it is mutating into something much darker, nihilism. He says nihilism is built on an enormous lie. It tells people that America's problems are unsolvable, that their personal struggles are not the result of bad decisions, bad luck, or even fixable structural flaws, but an all-encompassing evil system. That's really where a lot of this critical race theory, just critical theory, comes from as well. I might mention he doesn't say that, but I would add that to it as well. He says that mindset does not produce solutions. It prevents them. It short-circuits thought. It discourages effort, ultimately leads to personal and national self-destruction. And so then he gives you a quote from a Washington Post reporter who said, amid a wave of high-profile killings and political violence in the United States, investigators have been confounded regularly by the absence of a recognizable agenda. They were not Democrat or Republican, Islamist, militant, or Antifa or white supremacists. There's something new. In their manifestos, these attackers declared their contempt for humanity and a desire to see the collapse of civilization. By the way, I think that is an ideology, but we'll leave it at that. Law enforcement officers and federal prosecutors have begun to describe these attacks as a contemporary strain of nihilism, an online revival of the philosophical stance that arose in the 19th century to deny the existence of moral truths and the meaning of the universe. And so if you want to learn a little bit of history, can I delve into it just briefly? That goes back to a man by the name of Dostoevsky. Who's Dostoevsky? Well, he actually captured this phenomenon back in 1864 in the Notes from the Underground, in which he actually at the time described the human impulse to reject reason, to reject the idea of order, even self-interest, simply to assert independence. Strip people of the belief that they have meaningful choices, Dostoevsky said, and they will lash out, not despite the destruction that follows, but because of it. And he says this modern version takes the form in what the philosopher Karl Popper famously called the conspiracy theory of society. Where did the phrase conspiracy theory come from? Well, it came from philosopher Karl Popper. But it's different. Let's recognize that. Writing in the mid-20th century argued that a belief in divine forces faded and people then replaced gods because they no longer believed in a God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Judeo-Christian view, or the God, of course, that manifests himself as in the person of Jesus Christ, or even gods, but just sinister forces and imagined groups blamed for every social ill, which, by the way, I think explains a fair amount of anti-Semitism today. And so as a result, the economic hardships are coming about because of some of these nefarious groups. Now, Ben Shapiro is honest enough to say there are, of course, real conspiracies, but these involve identifiable people, specific actions, and evidence. And I don't think you can understand some of the people, as we talked about on Friday, that have taken and believed virtually everything that has been said by some of these anti-Jewish individuals on various websites. You can't understand some of the very radical on the left and even radical on the right, white supremacists on one side, Marxist revolutionaries on the left, who all are simply accepting and believing everything unless you understand that much of the wave of nihilism today is being actively cultivated by influencers and even by politicians. Politicians, I think, are making a mistake thinking that this will advance them, but it will turn on them in a minute, as some have come to find out. So he says the message being sold today is simple. Society is rigged, the system is evil, and only by following the right personality, the right movement, or the right truth teller can you break free. It's a con dressed up as enlightenment. And it is also, as he said, one of the most dangerous cons of our society and of our time. So again, I think we will come back to this issue of nihilism. I did allude to the fact that tomorrow we're going to talk about, as we look through the corridor of history, these corridors of history, we can see empires rise and then they fall. Why did they fall? And in some respects, why did they rise? So we're going to talk about some having a great golden age, and Johan Norberg talks about that. We're going to talk about the collapse of some of those. Victor Davis Hanson talks about those. And so, again, we have provided some of that in one of our booklets on, again, some of these historical cycles. But the one on why empires end, probably going to be a future booklet, but I wanted to try it out on you tomorrow because I think it's a good antidote to what Ben Shapiro was saying. We can solve some of these problems, but first we have to admit that they are problems. We can turn a country around, but we have to learn from history of how you do it. Otherwise, you end up being, again, in the dustbin of history. Anyway, those are our conversations we're going to have tomorrow. When we come back, we're going to talk about agriculture, going to talk about nutrition, going to talk about some of the prayers of presidents, so I hope you'll stay tuned. If you'd like more of the information we've covered so far, it's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Yes, we're going to spend some time talking about agriculture and nutrition. And if you listen to Point of View, you know we've been concerned about the fact that sometimes we've had foreign governments actually buying up farmland. Very concerned about the loss of the family farm. The Agricultural Secretary, Brooke Rollins, says the average age of a farmer today is 60 years of age. We need to get more young people involved in that. But also, we not only need to grow food better, we need to grow better food because we see that nearly 7 out of 10 Americans have some chronic disease. This is of real concern as well. And so I couldn't think of a better person to actually address that and many other issues than Nathan Sheets. Nate Sheets is a fifth-generation Texan, certainly part of President Trump's Make America Healthy Again. He is also running right now for Texas Agricultural Commission, has been endorsed by the governor of the state of Texas. But we could talk to him about a lot of other things. He helped launch the EvangeCube. He's one of the co-founders of I Am Second. Even this morning, I took some honey and put it on my cereal that came from Nate's Honey. So whether you talk about evangelism, whether you talk about his Christian convictions, whether you want to talk about entrepreneurship or church planting, Second Amendment, we certainly could talk about a lot of things. But Nate, I figured we'd talk about agriculture, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, what an honor to get to be on here with you today, sir.
Well, I've known you for many years. Matter of fact, there's an event that happens to be with the governor, you, and a variety of others on Wednesday, so probably get to see you face to face. But even though we couldn't put you in the studio, I know you're out there campaigning. But help us understand this, because whether you live in the state of Texas, and many of our stations are here, or across the country, because we have broadcast in over 40 different states, many of those are agricultural states, and almost every single day we're losing family farms, aren't we?
Oh, yes, sir. Last year in the United States, we lost 122,000 farms. And those aren't the big farms. Those aren't the large scale, like some people call them industrial corporate farms. These are the smaller family farms. In Texas, we lost 68 farms this week, and last week, all the way back to 2018, we've lost 18,000 farms. Just a few days ago, I was down in Beaumont meeting with a rice farmer. And, this is indicative of everything that's going across America, not just Texas. But I was meeting with this rice farmer, and he was sharing with me that he had just sold his rice crop for 40% less than it actually cost him to make it.
Wow.
And that's the reason why we see farmers leaving as never before.
Well, again, I think that is something that you and, of course, Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins have pointed out. But there are some really encouraging actions, not the least of which that the president has wanted to have America First trade. We've also recognized, we talked just a few minutes ago about tariffs, but there are some things that we can use and do to turn some of that around. But we can't have a business as usual mindset, can we?
No, sir, we can't. And I'll tell you that in 1980, a farmer made 40 cents of every $1 food. That was their revenue. Today, it's 15 cents. So, 40 years later, it's 60% less on revenue, but their expenses have gone up, 300%, 400%. The expenses like their seed, their diesel, their equipment costs, their labor. And so that's why farming has become untenable across America. But not only is it just the loss of farms, but we've also lost all of our food processing capabilities, which honestly is a national security issue, and I believe the president sees it that way as well. In Texas, We used to have 700 meatpacking plants all over Texas in the 70s. And at that time, a rancher made 70 cents of every $1 of food, and a meat packer made 30 cents. Well, here today, in 2025, there are 4 meatpacking companies that control 80% of the meat market in America.
Wow.
And now those meat packers make 70 cents, and the ranchers make 30. So we've got to really think about the way we feed ourselves in America through that same national security lens that President Trump looks at NVIDIA chips and steel manufacturing and other manufacturing that we're trying to bring back to America, but we need to include our food processing in that push.
One of the things that I've learned, and we have a link to your website, natesheets.com, and you can go to the website, pointofview.net, and find that. And matter of fact, if you'd like to have him come and speak for you, whether he becomes the Texas Agricultural Commissioner or not, he certainly can speak with a great deal of authority. That illustrates that when you talk about agriculture, it's almost like the spokes of a wheel. It relates to, of course, we just talked about the foreign influence with various governments buying farmlands. It relates as well to border security. And one of the things you've been writing about and talking about is border security starts with labor security. Can you explain that?
Yes, sir. I was just down at the border 2 weeks ago, and I was standing on this border where on the news we had seen migrants just pouring through under Joe Biden. And I did a video post to the president to say, sir, you said you were going to stop it, and you did. Look at this, brother, not a person in sight. And it was amazing. And so, he said that he was going to shut it down. He's done it. Now we're getting dangerous people out of America. And candidly, I don't care if you're a U.S. citizen or a legal alien. If you're, raping and killing and stealing, let's get them all out of here. But then this next level, we've got to really know who's in America. And, one of the things that we can do to ensure labor security is for there to be E-Verified in the agriculture industry business. I mean, we have EB-5 worker or H-2A workers, which is an agriculture program that Brooke Rollins said that we will not have any limitations on being able to access agriculture workers from coming in overseas. And when I was just at the border, these citrus growers were telling me that 60% of their laborers were H-2A workers, but the worst laborers that they had were actual Americans. And so we've got a labor issue in America.
Yes.
Not only do we have to ensure that we are not allowing illegal aliens to work, and that's why the E-Verify is so important. But secondly, we have got to bring a culture of hard work and determination back into America. The very thing that we built America on, 250 years later, we are missing it. And we have to do something to reimagine how we work in America.
Wow. When we come back from the break, I do want to talk about one other foreign influence, which you've talked about as well, and that's what's called agro-terrorism. Now, that might be a new concept for some of our listeners, but recently we were aware of the fact that you had some Chinese nationals that were smuggling in a fungus with the goal to try to devastate, I think it was wheat and barley and maize. Rice was another one. You think of our rice farmer here that was only able to sell rice for 40% of what it cost him to produce it. Imagine if all the rice had that fungus. So that is certainly an issue I wanted to talk about as well, because you're calling us to understand that agriculture is more than just farmers. It's like spokes in a wheel that touch almost every other issue we talk about here on Point of View. But then I do want to get into the fact that not only do you want to grow food better, you want to grow better food. Because if you look at some of the food that's showing up in our kids' schools, the kind of food that we're eating, the kind of chemicals, this gets us back to, again, make America healthy again. You certainly recognize how important all of that is. So let's take a break. If you'd like to know more about Nate Sheets, go to natesheets.com, or you can simply go to Point of View. We have a link there, and there's a lot of information, and it illustrates, again, why we really want to support our farmers, agriculture, and recognize that it is a very important aspect of national security. We'll talk about that with Nate Sheets right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program recently, we had a roundtable discussion about AI sermons. What stimulated the discussion was the article, Majority of Pastors Now Using AI to Prepare Sermons Amid Rapid Embrace of Technology. Leonardo Blair reports that the majority of pastors are using AI tools like ChatGPT and Grammarly to prepare their sermons. The 2025 State of AI in the Church Survey report provided the interview data. Nearly two-thirds of the church leaders surveyed prepare sermons using a wide variety of AI tools. Although some seem to be grappling with the ethical and practical considerations involved, most believe that AI can be beneficial. Currently, there's a range of AI tools that a pastor or anyone can use to prepare a message. At one end of the spectrum are tools that help you polish something that you are writing. Emails, blog posts, newsletters, or sermons. Checking spelling, grammar, or historical facts can be done with search engines and software built into word processing. Using these tools doesn't seem to raise any significant concerns. We would assume that church leaders would use such technologies to improve what they write and speak. At the other end are AI tools that essentially do all the work. For example, you could ask ChatGPT to write a sermon on 1 Peter 3 or a sermon on the 10 Commandments. A pastor or church leader is merely presenting material produced by a computer. We realize that most would be inclined to modify it somewhat to fit their audience and their own personality, but the essential material came from a computer. I'll leave it to you to evaluate how you feel about this. We were concerned that the church may be using AI tools too much. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nate Sheets with us for a few more minutes. And again, I would encourage you to go to the website to find out a little bit more. Individual that is running for Texas Agricultural Commissioner, but you have been raising some issues that I think needed to be addressed for a long time. And one of those is this idea of agro-terrorism. We have just more recently learned of some individuals that were trying to smuggle in a fungus from, I suspect, China, because these were Chinese nationals who would actually want to destroy our food system. And that's just another aspect of what agricultural commissioners, whether in Texas or all over the United States, really need to start paying attention to.
That's exactly right. You know, there are adversarial countries that we have had concern about buying farmland in the United States, yet at the same time, through things like what we were just mentioning, biosecurity, where there's an intentionality of smuggling in blights or worms that they could let loose into agriculture, which would be devastating. But at the same time, we allow a lot of foreign adversaries to be involved in the way that we feed ourselves, like we were mentioning earlier, just about the loss of food processing. And there's agriculture companies actually based out of Beijing, China, owned by the Communist Party of China, that are involved and sell seed and other chemicals to Americans, to American farmers. And when we think about, we're so focused on making sure that we don't have fentanyl come in, yet at the same time, we have our grocery store and our farmlands wide open to them on the front end. So we just really need to be thoughtful and strategic about how we revamp agriculture and really rethink how we protect ourselves from a national security standpoint as we feed ourselves as well.
Well, let's talk about nutrition. Make America healthy again. We spend a very significant amount of money, Nate, on school lunch programs. All for it. I think it's a good idea. But it seems to me that we're going to spend that much money. Maybe we should also be spending some money, or maybe even just investing volunteer time on helping our next generation know where food comes from, how to eat a balanced diet, the long-term impact of how you eat and whether you exercise. It does seem to me that we've been going the wrong direction for a long time, and I get the sense, Nate, that you want to turn that around.
Absolutely. In the school lunch program in the state of Texas, we are 44th in the nation in nutritional value.
Wow.
We're at 41st in education, so I think that we just don't link those two things, but they are absolutely linked. And I would just say over the past 40, 50 years in America, we have been in the pursuit of cheap, inexpensive calories on the go. And so but the result of that is today, all these years later, like you said earlier, 70% of all Americans have one chronic disease or more. 78% of kids 18 to 25 are ineligible to serve in the military because of their health. we're spending $1 trillion revamping our military, but I hope they're drones because we might not be able to man it into the future. But we also spend $4 trillion a year treating symptoms of diseases related to the food that we eat. And in Texas, we spent $100 billion on Medicaid last year. So when I think about kids, it's almost like a 401k. I mean, you're investing money early when you're young because you know that it's going to pay dividends later on. But we don't think about food like that. And so when I think about kids and feeding kids in the school lunch program, I want to take that same mindset that we look at something like investing into your future and retirement by investing into these kids, because we're paying for it as a country. We're just paying for it on the back end in healthcare costs, but also in quality of life. And so if we think about being a productive country that can really, continue to advance in all aspects of technology and agriculture and banking and finance, we need healthy people. And so, I just think that we need to look at the way that we feed ourselves through that same lens of, it might cost us a little bit more up front, but it's going to be worth it on the back end.
What kind of relationship could take place between, of course, in your case, the state of Texas, but any state, with the fact that I mentioned just a minute ago, the Secretary of Agriculture is Brooke Rollins, a Texas A&M grad, an individual that worked for the Texas Public Policy Group. And then, of course, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, talking about, of course, this idea of make America healthy again. Up until now, it's almost like every state's done their own agricultural program, and they're just doing ag extension and making sure that we've got good ag programs in the various state colleges. But there seems to me maybe now a joint venture between the states and the national government because of some of the emphasis that Robert F. Kennedy or Brooke Rollins is having at the national level. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I was just with Brooke Rollins down at the border dealing with the New World screwworm facility that's being opened to combat that, which impacts cattle and wildlife. And I was actually texting with Bobby Kennedy last week just about the need for us to be able to, as a state of Texas, come alongside. The federal government is driving so much of the agriculture and the health development aspects because Donald Trump sees both of these as a national security issue. And for instance, in agriculture, the focus is how can we move traditional agriculture, tilling and plant, to more regenerative agriculture, which is not using chemicals, but using animals to graze down a land, not tilling the soil, but using drills to drill the seed in, which over time starts to build the organic material back into the soil, which means more nutritional food that we're able to farm and eat. So, what the federal government is looking for are state partners that can come alongside and really take what they are thinking nationally, but test it out locally. But at the same time, they also want states to be innovative and to be driven to go and try things on their own and see what works and start to bring, the best of the best up to the national level and figure out how we can start to implement it nationally. But in agriculture, we have to do incrementalism, which means not trying to do things overnight, but having a vision for where we need to go and a plan to get there. An example of it gone wrong was Sri Lanka in 2022 decided that they were going to go completely regenerative overnight. And they stopped using all of the inputs, the fertilizers, the chemicals. And the next year, their entire economy crashed because they were the soil was so addicted to the chemicals to be productive, relying upon other countries because they had no food to be able to feed themselves. Their unemployment rate went up to, I think, 30% because they are such a agriculture and focused country. So that's just a perfect example of it's not something we can do overnight. We need to do it incrementally and have a vision for where we want to get to in 3 to 5 years.
Might just mention, too, I did a commentary a while back on what happened in Sri Lanka, so you could use the search engine there on the Point of View website. But, Nate, just as we wind down, some people kind of like to know you. Of course, you're a Christian, fifth-generation Texan, Navy veteran, conservative Republican, obviously, as an individual that also developed a honey business, first, I guess, really from your backyard, and now the #1 branded honey company in America, pro-family, pro-life. It does seem to me that all those things come together because, indeed, if you're going to be in government office, you need to be a person of integrity, of innovation, and, of course, transparency. And that's what you are all about, isn't it?
Yes, sir. I actually office right upstairs from you, or right down the hall from you at E3 Partners there in Plano, Texas, for many years. You know, when I was serving in ministry, I had a desire to make an impact for God's kingdom. And when I went into business in 2010, I started doing the honey company full time. And I still had a desire to make an impact in God's kingdom. I just did it through the business platform of Make Your Nates, and starting with this one beehive and turning it into the largest honey company in America. But even the role of what I'm pursuing, you know, trying to be the Texas Department of Agriculture Commissioner, I'm not doing this because I feel like I've got to have one more, you know, box checked on my resume of getting into politics. I'm genuinely doing this because I want to come alongside and serve the community of Texas, serve America, but also make an impact for God's kingdom. Because there's no greater spiritual warfare when Satan tries to come against the good works that God created us to walk in than to try to get people sick. And ultimately, God works all things together for his good. And so what Satan intends for evil, God intends for good. And Satan can never thwart what God's plans are. Thinks that he can. And I think food and our health is one way that he tries to get people off trying to make an impact for eternity in the way that they live.
Nathan Sheets, again, you can go to the website, natesheets.com, find out more about him. Might even have him come and speak to your group as well. And if you'd like to know more about his campaign, of course, that's there as well. Whether you live in the state of Texas or not, you need to know about some of the things that I am encouraged about. And certainly, Nate, I appreciate you writing about those, speaking about those. And thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. Have a great day.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, it is President's Day, so we thought we'd wind down with our good friend Jerry Newcombe. What are some of the most significant prayers of some of these presidents? Well, we'll talk about that with him. If you find yourself saying, I might even like to read a book on that subject, it's not one that he has written, but it's one that we have posted so that you can find out a little bit more about that, because there are just some great opportunities for you to learn more about what he is making available through Providence Forum, what we're making available through Point of View, and some of the very excellent books that have been written on the topic. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, of course, it's President's Day, and as I mentioned before in the past, if you are a Truth Team member, you received some of the booklets I'm holding up right now, those of you watching online. One Nation Under God, Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers, Constitutional Interpretation, Patriot Preachers, to mention just a few. We have booklets coming out, by the way, on the Declaration of Independence and on America's founding, just a couple of other booklets along with others of booklets in the news, and that's one of the reasons I would encourage encourage you to consider what you might do to support Point of View. But as we wind down today, we wanted to talk about some of the prayers of presidents. One of the articles we have posted is also a link to a new book that's out by Bill Federer, Prayers and Presidents, Inspiring Faith from Leaders of the Past. And we thought that it would be good to maybe talk about some of those prayers of presidents with our good friend, Dr. Jerry Newcombe, who is the Executive Director of Providence Forum. He's the on-air host of Truths That Transforms. He's an individual that has his master's degree from Wheaton Graduate School, his doctorate from Knox Theological Seminary, a good friend, a fellow talk show host. And Jerry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you. Good to be with you again, Kerby. And by the way, I'm not on the Truths That Transform in the same way I was, but I'm certainly going strong with the Providence Forum.
Yes. And again, I might just mention that we have that kind of as a list of what you were. And again, those are credentials you've had in the past, as well as the fact that you've just been so involved in producing so many television documentaries, author of so many books, almost 36 books. This one by Bill Federer is one that is an attempt to remind us of some inspiring aspect of every one of the presidents. But I thought today we might focus on, maybe in the first segment, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Then we come back from the break. Maybe we can talk about a couple more contemporary ones, Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. But what about George Washington? You could fill an entire 2 hours with all the stories about George Washington. You, of course, co-authored an outstanding book on the sacred fire of George Washington. But we so often have people say, well, he was probably Unitarian, he was a deist. But that doesn't fit the profile of George Washington, does it?
No, it doesn't. George Washington was a committed 18th century Anglican. He was not only a huge reader of the Bible, but he was also a big consumer of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer of his denomination of choice, the Anglican Church. And that book, by the way, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, is extremely orthodox. It's filled with prayers, all based on Scripture. Just to give an example, when a British general died in a major battle in the French and Indian War, and the young George Washington was the only officer who was spared that battle. Even chaplains died, and so there was no chaplain available, so George Washington served as chaplain for the burial service by torchlight because it was dangerous. That night of July 9th, 1755, George Washington was 23 years old. He miraculously survived when some people on the other side even pointed their guns at him and just fired, and nothing killed him. He had 2 horses shot underneath him and so forth. Anyway, he took that Book of Common Prayer and he performed the normal Church of England service for a funeral, and that included lots of Scripture, beginning, for example, with I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even though he dies. These are words of Jesus Christ, of course, as found in John chapter 11, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And here's George Washington, who would be destined to become our first president and our first, the father of our country. And he's, talking about Jesus and, how Jesus gives us hope in life, even when people have died, such as the case of that British general, Edward Braddock. In 1774, jumping ahead a few years in his life, George Washington wrote in his diary one day, June 1, 1774, went to church and fasted all day. Now, this is interesting. The governor of the state of Virginia at that time was Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote up a prayer and fasting proclamation for the people of Virginia to pray. And mainly they were praying because their fellow Americans in Boston, their harbor was being blocked by the British on June 1st. It was a big deal, and it was retaliation against the Boston Tea Party that Samuel Adams likely organized, behind the scenes and so forth. But anyway, the British thought, well, we'll punish Boston, and nobody else is going to help them. And in reality, that actually helped to unify a lot of the other colonies who were praying for their brethren, and then they were also providing substance of needs and so forth. They were actually collecting foodstuffs and things like that and sending it to their fellow Americans in Boston. But it began with prayer, and I just thought that was a very interesting thing. And George Washington, for example, when he became our first president under the U.S. Constitution, not only did his first inaugural address have all kinds of references to God and, basically saying in his Baroque style that nobody should be more grateful than the people of the United States that we were able to become a country. But he led everybody in the government and their wives to a nearby chapel. This was in New York City.
I think we've lost Jerry, but again,
2 hours.
There they go.
They had a 2-hour Christian worship service there, including communion. And later, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, who was there, and of course his wife was there, and she wrote in her diary, President George Washington partook the communion. I was there. I witnessed this myself. So anyway, the idea that people have, that Washington was not a Christian is it's just not accurate.
Well, and I might just mention real quickly that he also issued all sorts of proclamations for days of prayer and thanksgiving and fasting and the rest. And, of course, again, that one when the British blockaded Boston's harbor, what's he put in his diary? Went to church and fasted all day. Well, that doesn't strike me as an individual that isn't having some kind of faith. Just to keep it moving, though, how about Abraham Lincoln? Because, again, this was the idea of even having a national day of prayer, thanksgiving, and even ultimately humiliation. That was something that was certainly part of the teaching and preaching and proclamations of Abraham Lincoln, wasn't it?
It was. And in fact, during the dark days of the Civil War in March of 1863, he called for a national day of fasting and prayer on behalf of the Union and the whole country to take place the next month, which was April 30, 1863. That was the date that he had people pray. And he said in that proclamation, it's so beautiful. It's almost like a sermon. It's a sermon along the lines of Deuteronomy 6, where God warns his people, when you get into the promised land and you've eaten your full, don't forget the source of all this, which is me. And so, Abraham Lincoln says, we have been the choicest recipients of the bounties of heaven like no other nation before us. And yet we have forgotten God, intoxicated with unbroken success. We've somehow thought, this is our doing that we have prospered so much. We need to remember God. We need to pray. We need to ask for clemency. We need to ask for forgiveness, in other words, and repent of our sins. It's a beautiful prayer proclamation. Abraham Lincoln.
And we have posted that before for people to see. But just as we're coming to a break, let me just mention that if you find yourself saying, well, I've never heard half of this, and that's probably true, maybe all of this, we do not necessarily making available, but just giving you a chance to know about the prayers and presidents, inspiring faith from leaders of the past. And of course, we have just mentioned George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, but we have statements and claims and prayers from John Adams and James Madison, and all sorts of individuals before that. But when we come back, we'll also talk about, well, what about Franklin Delano Roosevelt? What about Dwight Eisenhower? What about Ronald Reagan? Of course, the fact is that because we have this National Day of Prayer, a lot of that goes back to Ronald Reagan. And if you find yourself saying, well, I would like to know more about that, that is available in the book. But also we have a link to Jerry Newcomb's providenceforum.org. We've so many times mentioned how valuable those resources are. And on this 250th anniversary of this country, 1776, just a great opportunity for you to learn from some of the videos that he's engaged in, some of the documentaries, some of the great resources. There's all sorts of podcasts and other resources that you would find helpful. And I think it's important for us to, this particular year, especially to teach our children and our grandchildren. And some of those resources are available at pointofview.net, or you can go directly to providenceforum.org. Let's come back and talk about a few of the more contemporary individuals that have been praying for this nation, because on this President's Day, we want to recognize all of them. And we'll come back and continue our conversation with Dr. Jerry Newcombe right after this.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, privileged to have with us today Dr. Jerry Newcombe, and I might just point you to providenceforum.org. We have a link on the website in case you would like it. And Jerry, we of course talked about some prayers from presidents in the 18th and 19th century. Let's bring it up to at least the 20th century, maybe even the 21st century, because in some respects, what began in this country has continued with some of the presidents in more recent years, hasn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, I have right before me my dad's copy. This is really cool. My dad served in the military in World War II, and I have a little book. It's the New Testament, a pocket New Testament, and the front page says the White House, Washington, March 6, 1941. So here's a letter, at the front of the Bible from Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president. And he said, quote, "As Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces of the United States. Throughout the centuries, men of many faiths and diverse origins have found in the sacred book words of wisdom, counsel, and inspiration. It is a fountain of strength, and now, as always, an aid in attaining the highest aspirations of the human soul." And, of course, we all know about, or well, maybe we don't, on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Franklin D. Roosevelt had a famous prayer. And may I read that to you?
Please do.
To your listeners? Okay. "Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization. Help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice." June 6, 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
So again,
And by the way, did you ever hear that story? I'm sorry for interrupting. Remember when Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were meeting on a warship during the time of World War II, and there were all these sailors that were there, and they all sang together, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." There's video of this. You can see it yourself. It's fascinating.
I might just jump in real quickly and just say, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, type in FDR's prayer and scroll down, you will have the basically summary of what was actually said by him and how, again, that particular prayer was so significant. And again, if you wanted to find out more about that, we do have a link. But let's go bring it up to date, because in addition to that, we wouldn't have a National Day of Prayer if it weren't for Ronald Reagan, right?
Yes, and even Truman. Truman is the one who made it national. I mean,
that's true. Yeah.
Every year, but it was Reagan who made it that it would be specifically the first Thursday of every May. So you're absolutely right. The tradition gets back ultimately to Reagan via Truman, or Truman via Reagan. In any event, this is a wonderful time for Americans to get together and pray. And in fact, I would encourage your listeners around noon, make sure to spend some time in prayer for the nation. We sure could use it. I mean, the America 250 is a big anniversary. Unfortunately, as you well know, Kerby, a lot of people will be celebrating it without realizing, what it is we're celebrating. And Ronald Reagan once said this. He said, "America is one nation under God, but if we ever forget that, we'll be one nation gone under."
Yes. Let's, if we can, talk about what you are doing through the Providence Forum. I love the countdown clock, 137 days, which, again, for those of us at Point of View, those of you at Providence Forum, and many other people, we really want to do what we can to educate. But you are old enough to remember when we had our bicentennial, our 200th anniversary, how patriotic it was. I'm a little bit uncertain about what it's going to be like on our 250th. What are your thoughts, and what are you doing to try to turn that around?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kerby. And, I remember even before the election in November 2024, I was thinking in reference, and even writing about this, in reference to July 4, 2026, will it be morning in America in the Ronald Reagan sense, MORNING, as in the first part of the day, or will it be mourning in America, like what you do when you're weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, MOURNING. Maybe that's corny, but the bottom line is
good.
There is a huge difference of philosophy. Some people view America like as if it's just some sort of terrible thing. In reality, as you well know, people risk their lives to try and come here to enjoy what we so often take for granted day after day. Kerby, when you think about the whole borders crisis and even the issue of trying to deport people and ICE and all the controversy surrounding that, what is really at stake, or what is the real bottom line issue? A lot of people want to be here in America. That's what that means. In the old days, the communists, they had to build walls like the Berlin Wall to keep their citizens from leaving. We have to build walls, in order to process people properly that want to come here, which is a beautiful thing. There's a lot of greatness, but as my good friend Paul Jaley says, a lot of people enjoy the fruit of the American experience, but they don't necessarily care for the root of it, which gets back to the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Let's talk about some of the resources that are available at the Providence Forum. I mean, people can hear interviews you've done with Paul Kenger, Oz Guinness. I mean, the list, matter of fact, I won't even try to make the long list because it's a very long list of individuals. And then they can watch these videos. So if they find themselves with a child or a grandchild that doesn't have a clue about the founding of this country, you have resources there that could really educate them about this, and maybe even take some of these prayers of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, whatever it might be, and begin to express what was part of American history and how it needs to come alive for them again here in the 21st century.
Sure. And in fact, for example, at providenceforum.org, I have this part where you can see that there's 7 different films I made, hour-long films, about America's Judeo-Christian roots. And then I decided to just kind of carve this information into little small chunks, because our attention span so often is compromised these days. And so anyway, just to and we're so busy. Sometimes it's just so hard to keep up with things. But it is neat to see how the Bible played such a critical role in the founding of the nation. I mean, George Washington, again, the father of our country, said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Of course, when he was talking about religion, the dominant religion was Christianity of one stripe or another. John Adams, second president, said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Thomas Jefferson, our third president. By the way, by God's grace, I was able to hire Mike Huckabee to do the voice of Thomas Jefferson for my documentary series on the foundation. And so, for example, Jefferson, a year after he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he co-founded an evangelical church, which called an evangelical minister to be the pastor, the Reverend Charles Clay. It was called the Calvinistical Reformed Church of Charlottesville. And he wrote the subscription for it. In other words, the charter for that church.
Very good.
And it says, we being desirous of gospel knowledge are establishing this church so we could have the Holy Scriptures expounded to us.
Yes. Well, again, I wish we had more time, but of course, that's always the experience we have with, again, Jerry Newcombe. If you would like to know more, go to Providence Forum. You're going to find some great information there, lots of podcasts, lots of information. And during this 250th year celebration, we want to continue to joint venture with you. So, Jerry, thank you for joining us. And as always, I look forward to the next opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Kerby, and happy President's Day.
Happy President's Day to everyone. And again, want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.